Margaret Williams, 68, was going through her usual morning routine. Her home in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Boston was basking in the warm glow of the morning sun. She sat by the window, sipping coffee from her favorite porcelain cup, gazing at the flowers blooming in her garden. "The morning glories that Amy loved are blooming beautifully again this year," Margaret murmured softly. Memories of her granddaughter Amy flitted through her mind. The tragedy from 5 years ago had left a deep wound in her heart. After finishing her breakfast, Margaret settled onto the sofa in the living room. She turned on the television, and her usual morning show was on. "Looks like it'll be another peaceful day," she thought. But her tranquil daily life was suddenly interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. "Yes, who is it?" Margaret opened the door to find 2 police officers standing there. "Good morning, are you Margaret Williams?" the older officer asked in a gentle tone. "Yes, I am." "Has something happened?" Anxiety seeped into Margaret's voice. "We've come to talk to you about something. May we come in?" Confused, Margaret invited the 2 officers into her home. She led them to the living room and gestured for them to sit on the sofa. "Mrs. Williams, this may come as a shock, but..." the older officer began. "Your granddaughter has been found and taken into protective custody. She's severely malnourished." Margaret was momentarily at a loss for words. "I'm sorry, my granddaughter." "Yes, a 12-year-old girl named Amy Johnson. She says she's your granddaughter." The color drained from Margaret's face. There must be some mistake. My granddaughter Amy passed away 5 years ago." The officers exchanged surprised looks. "What?" the older officer exclaimed. "You say she passed away 5 years ago?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, in a fire. Amy was 7 years old." Her voice trembled. The officers looked at each other, bewildered. The younger officer carefully spoke up. "But the girl we found is definitely calling herself Amy Johnson. And she knew your name and address accurately." Margaret's mind was in turmoil. Her granddaughter, who was supposed to be dead, is alive. What could this mean? Her heart began to race. What does this mean?" Margaret asked in a shaky voice. The older officer took a deep breath and began to explain. "The girl we found was discovered in a supermarket yesterday. She was extremely thin and malnourished. After being examined at the hospital, she revealed her identity to us." Margaret was speechless. After a moment of silence, she reached for her coffee cup with trembling hands. "Is this a dream?" The officers looked at Margaret with sympathetic eyes. "Mrs. Williams, we don't have all the details yet. But there's a high possibility that this girl is your granddaughter. Would you be willing to meet her?" Margaret exhaled deeply. "Yes. I'll meet her." Her voice was a mix of determination and fear. The officers stood up and began preparing to escort Margaret to the police station. Margaret gazed out the window, remembering the tragic day 5 years ago. Sitting in the back of the police car, Margaret's mind wandered back to that day 5 years ago. September 15, 2018, the day that changed her life forever. It was Amy's 7th birthday. Margaret had visited her daughter Sarah and son-in-law Mike's house to celebrate her granddaughter's birthday. The whole family had spent a wonderful time together, and Amy was delighted with her new bicycle. "Grandma, look! I can ride by myself now," Amy had shouted happily as she rode her new bike in the garden. Margaret had smiled, proud of her granddaughter's growth. "That's wonderful, Amy. You're such a smart girl." That night, Margaret returned home. She was tired but happy. However, her happiness didn't last long. In the middle of the night, she was awakened by a sudden phone call. When she picked up the receiver, she heard Sarah's panicked voice. "Mom! There's a fire. The house is burning." Margaret immediately jumped up and rushed to Sarah's house. But by the time she arrived, it was already too late. The house was engulfed in flames, and firefighters were desperately trying to extinguish the fire. "Sarah! Mike! Where's Amy?" Margaret frantically asked when she found her daughter and son-in-law. Sarah answered, sobbing, "Amy. We can't find Amy." The next few hours were like a nightmare. The firefighters searched diligently, but Amy couldn't be found. And the next morning, the worst news arrived. "I'm sorry. We found a small body in the second-floor bedroom." The fire chief's voice was heavy. Margaret collapsed to her knees. Sarah and Mike embraced each other, crying uncontrollably. Their beloved daughter, Margaret's precious granddaughter, was gone. The cause of the fire was determined to be an electrical system malfunction, and it was concluded that Amy had passed away in her sleep from smoke inhalation. The family was enveloped in deep sorrow. After the funeral, Sarah and Mike, unable to bear their grief, decided to move abroad. "Mom, I'm sorry. But being here, it reminds us of Amy. We can't go on living here," Sarah said tearfully. Margaret understood her daughter and son-in-law's decision, but her own heart was torn as well. "I understand, Sarah. Your happiness is what's most important." And so, Sarah and Mike moved to Europe. Margaret was left alone in Boston. Every day, she would talk to Amy's photo, remembering her lost granddaughter. And now, 5 years later, this sudden news was about to shake her life once again. As the police vehicle arrived at the station, Margaret took a deep breath. Her heart was filled with anticipation and fear for what was about to unfold. Upon arriving at the police station, Margaret could feel her heart pounding fiercely. The older officer guided her to a small room. "Mrs. Williams, the girl is in this room." "Are you ready?" the officer asked gently. Margaret took a deep breath and answered in a trembling voice, "Yes, please." As the door opened, there sat a small girl. Margaret gasped. The girl indeed resembled Amy, but her emaciated figure had erased much of the lovely granddaughter she remembered from 5 years ago. Amy slowly raised her face, and the moment her eyes met Margaret's, she whispered in a small voice, "Grandma." Hearing that voice, tears began to flow from Margaret's eyes. "Amy, is it really you?" Amy tried to stand up but stumbled due to her weakened state. Margaret instinctively rushed forward and embraced her granddaughter. "Grandma, I missed you." Amy clung to Margaret with her small arms. As Margaret held her granddaughter, she felt a pain in her chest at Amy's emaciated condition. Amy's bony shoulders, two thin arms, and painfully protruding ribs. Her hair had lost its luster, and her complexion was poor. "Amy, to think you were alive all this time. We thought you had passed away," Margaret spoke tearfully. Amy nodded slightly. "I was scared, but I always remembered you, Grandma." Margaret was overwhelmed with complex emotions. Joy and relief, along with anger and sadness imagining Amy's suffering over the past 5 years. Her heart felt like it was being torn apart by joy and pain. "Amy, it's okay now. Grandma's here." Margaret gently rubbed her granddaughter's back. An officer quietly entered the room. "Mrs. Williams, the medical team has arrived. We'd like to check Amy's health condition, if that's all right." Margaret hesitated but understood that Amy's health was the top priority. "I understand. Amy, it's okay. Grandma will be right here." While the medical team began examining Amy, Margaret received an explanation of the situation from the officer. Amy was in a state of severe malnutrition, and there were concerns about psychological trauma from long-term confinement. After the examination, the doctor approached Margaret. "Mrs. Williams, your granddaughter's condition is stable, but she'll need long-term hospitalization. Along with physical recovery, psychological care will also be crucial." Margaret nodded. "I understand. I'll do anything for Amy." That night, Margaret stayed in Amy's hospital room. She held her granddaughter's small hand tightly, quietly shedding tears. Various emotions, joy and sorrow, relief and anger, raced through her mind. "Amy, I'll never let you go again. Grandma will always protect you," Margaret gently spoke to the sleeping Amy. And in her heart, a determination to walk this new path with Amy began to grow. The road ahead would surely not be smooth, but with Amy by her side, she resolved to face forward and move on. The next day, Margaret found herself in a police interrogation room, listening to Amy's testimony. A psychological counselor was present, carefully proceeding with the conversation while considering Amy's mental state. Amy began speaking in a small voice. "That day, I woke up because of the smoke. I was scared and screamed, but no one came. Fear was visible in her eyes. Then, a strange man came in through the window and said, 'I'll help you.' But..." Amy's words faltered. Margaret gently squeezed her granddaughter's hand, encouraging her, "It's okay, Amy. Take your time." Amy took a deep breath and continued. "That man took me out, but he didn't let me go home. I was locked in a dark room." According to her testimony, the kidnapper, Robert Harrison, 60, had kept Amy confined in an old warehouse in the suburbs. Amy was given minimal food and her outings were strictly limited. Uncle Robert would sometimes say with a scary face, "Stay here until your grandma hands over the treasure," Amy recounted in a trembling voice. The police officer carefully asked, "Amy, did this Robert seem to know your grandma well? Amy nodded. Yes, he knew Grandma's name and talked about Grandpa too. Hearing this testimony, Margaret was confused. I don't know anyone by the name of Robert Harrison. The investigator frowned. Mrs. Williams, do you have any recollection of your late husband's acquaintances? Margaret thought about her husband, George. George was in the art-dealing business. But I've never heard of anyone named Robert. At that moment, a young officer entered the room. We have a development in the investigation. Robert Harrison has a record of being arrested for art fraud 15 years ago. And it turns out he was a former colleague of Mr. George Williams. Margaret was shocked. No way. To think George was involved with such a person. The investigator carefully proceeded. Mrs. Williams, we'd like to search your home, if that's all right. There might be some clues about the treasure Robert Harrison mentioned. Margaret hesitated but realized she had to cooperate to uncover the truth. I understand. Please do. While the police search team examined Margaret's house, she stayed by her granddaughter's side. Several hours later, the investigator returned. Mrs. Williams, we discovered a hidden room in your basement. There. The investigator continued, choosing his words carefully. We found several highly valuable paintings stored there. Margaret was at a loss for words. I had no idea. The investigator looked at her sympathetically. These paintings have been internationally listed as stolen goods. It's highly likely that your husband was hiding them. Margaret's mind was in turmoil. To think that her beloved husband had been harboring such a secret. And that secret had condemned her granddaughter to 5 years of captivity. But why didn't Robert demand this from me directly? Margaret voiced her question. The investigator speculated, he probably realized you didn't know about the paintings. And by taking Amy hostage, he might have been trying to pressure you. Margaret heaved a deep sigh. Before her lay great challenges, her husband's hidden past, her granddaughter's grueling 5 years, and their life going forward. Amy, we have a long road ahead of us. But let's overcome it together. Margaret gently embraced her granddaughter. Amy nodded slightly. Yes, Grandma. If we're together, I'm sure we'll be okay. In Margaret's heart, courage to face these difficulties began to sprout. Though the life ahead would surely not be easy, she was determined to move forward with Amy by her side. Margaret paced anxiously in the hospital hallway. As Amy's treatment continued, she had managed to contact her daughter Sarah and son-in-law Mike. Amidst their shock and confusion, they immediately decided to return home. Mom, we're heading to Boston right now. Is Amy really? Sarah's voice trembled over the phone. Margaret took a deep breath before answering, Yes, Sarah. Amy is alive. But she's very weak. A few hours later, Sarah and Mike arrived at the hospital. Their faces showed the fatigue of a long journey and anxiety about what was to come. Mom. Sarah rushed to Margaret as soon as she saw her, embracing her tightly. Mike approached as well, asking with a serious expression, "Please, tell us what's going on." Margaret guided them to a quiet place and explained in detail the events that had transpired. Sarah and Mike's expressions changed from surprise and joy to deep sorrow. "Can we see Amy?" Sarah asked, tears welling up in her eyes. Margaret nodded gently. "Yes, but she's still very weak. Please approach her slowly." The three of them headed to Amy's hospital room. When they opened the door, Amy was lying curled up in bed. Sarah gasped, and Mike turned away. "Amy, Mom and Dad are here," Margaret called out gently. Amy slowly raised her face and looked at her parents. Tears began to well up in her eyes. "Mom! Dad!" Sarah rushed to Amy's bedside, crying, and carefully embraced her daughter. Mike approached as well, and the family of three hugged each other. "I'm sorry, Amy. We should have kept searching for you," Sarah apologized through her tears. Amy shook her head slightly. "It's okay, Mom. I was always thinking about you and Dad." Margaret watched this emotional reunion from a short distance. Her heart was filled with joy, but she also felt anxious about the long road to recovery ahead. Over the next few weeks, Amy's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. Her nutritional state improved, and she began to gain weight. However, healing the wounds in her heart would take much longer. "Amy, how are you feeling today?" Margaret asked one day when she visited the hospital room. Amy smiled slightly. "A little better, I think. But I still have scary dreams sometimes." Sarah and Mike visited Amy every day, trying to rebuild their family bond. They were carefully reconstructing their relationship with Amy, guided by advice from the psychological counselor. "Amy, we'll always be here for you. Even if you're scared, you're not alone anymore," Mike gently held his daughter's hand. Surrounded by her family's love, Amy gradually began to smile more. She started to share bits and pieces of her experiences over the past 5 years with her parents and Margaret. It was a painful process for the whole family, but it was also healing. As the day of discharge approached, the family discussed their future life. Sarah and Mike decided to arrange their work and stay in Boston for a while. "Amy's recovery is our top priority," Sarah said with determination. "Let's overcome this difficulty as a family." Margaret was grateful for her daughter and son-in-law's decision and saw hope for Amy's future. She felt that the family bond was growing stronger through this trial. About a month after Amy's discovery, Robert Harrison's trial began. Margaret, Sarah, Mike, and Amy, who had been allowed to attend with her doctor's approval, were present in the courtroom. The prosecution presented a wealth of evidence, including Robert's criminal history, Amy's testimony, and the discovered paintings. Robert maintained an expressionless face throughout, but made an unexpected statement at the end. "I admit my guilt." However, it was triggered by George Williams' betrayal. This statement caused an uproar in the courtroom. After the judge called for order, Robert continued. "George and I were making significant profits from art deals. But suddenly, he hid everything and betrayed me. I was just trying to get back my share." Margaret was hit with complex emotions as she learned of this unknown side of her husband. However, she couldn't justify Robert's actions. The trial continued for several weeks, and ultimately, Robert was sentenced to a long prison term. After the trial, the family was trying to start a new life. Amy was gradually adapting to daily life, although she still occasionally suffered from panic attacks. "It's okay, Amy. Take deep breaths," Sarah gently embraced her daughter. "We're here with you." Margaret was also fully supporting her granddaughter's recovery. She went for walks with Amy every day, cooked together, and read books with her. "Grandma, I feel like I'm getting a little stronger, bit by bit," Amy told Margaret one day. Margaret hugged her granddaughter and said, "That's right, Amy. You're such a strong girl." The family also had to face the past of the late George. While disappointed in her husband's actions, Margaret tried not to forget his good sides as well. Was Dad a bad person? When Amy asked this, Margaret answered carefully. "People are complex, Amy. Grandpa made mistakes, but he still loved our family. What's important is that we learn from his mistakes and become better people." As time passed, the family bond deepened. Amy gradually started going to school and made new friends. Sarah and Mike slowly resumed their work while cherishing their time with their daughter. Margaret was proud of her family for overcoming this ordeal. She knew they couldn't get back the lost 5 years, but she found hope for the life ahead. "It's the beginning of our new life," Margaret smiled as she watched her family relaxing in the garden. Amy ran up to Margaret and took her hand. "Grandma, let's plant flowers together." Margaret felt happiness in her granddaughter's smile. She vowed in her heart to cherish each day, living it preciously with her family.